So it's great to be back up here again. We have, hi Anne. Anne up there from the World Economic Forum. And then we have Gilbert, Alistair, and Chris. So we've got, this panel really brings together folks who are on the cutting edge of what's happening with data and folks who have done their best within the organizational context to really innovate in that context. And so we're going to hear from both sides of the river and maybe have some discussion about how they might connect in the future. But let's start off with the conventional side of things. So I'm going to ask Alistair from BT to share what you guys are doing now. Like, how did you get into this area and what you guys are doing for customers?
Yeah, so thanks for that. So again, it's Alistair working in the digital identity team at EE. And again, like Sham was eloquently speaking earlier from InfoBip about the fact that the mobile network operators have massive reach and we're sitting on a lot of valuable data. We are working with other companies, right, like NatWest, and we're working with them to use that data, that real-time data, on our customers, on our mutual customers, to help protect them from fraud, to help identify like money laundering, to help improve the customer experience.
Right, cool. And Gilbert, you're on the other side of the river, on the cutting edge. You work with Pool. What does Pool do?
Well, I'm liking all the watery analogies, and I think the river one's good. So yeah, from rivers to pools. So Pool provides infrastructure. Well, but basically my background, I'm a privacy technologist and entrepreneur. I got into all this via cookie solutions back in the day from a marketing background. And it's been quite a journey down the river, to labour the analogy. At Pool, what we do is provide infrastructure for a new type of data intermediary, which we and others are calling data unions. And that infrastructure can take the form of sort of payment rails, of data governance, and also of funding for, what are data unions? Basically, there's been a lot of talk about, the individual taking back control of their data. And there's also a disconnect between the fact that we all have this data, it's out there in lots of different places, and most of us have better things to do with our time or don't know where to start in terms of repatriating that data and doing something with it. The idea of data intermediaries or data unions is that you can have people who are regulated and can represent your data rights and also help your data find its true value, which is the exciting bit. So that's me.
Interesting. We'll get back and ask you more questions about how all that works. But Anne, can you share a little bit about who you are and why we are beaming you all the way in from California?
Absolutely, Kaliya. Well, pleasure to be virtually here, the wonders of technology. I'm based in the World Economic Forum's Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution in San Francisco, California. That's a really long-winded way of saying that as a neutral platform for public-private multi-stakeholder collaboration, the forum has a center where we look at sort of those big, intractable, challenging policy questions around technology governance. Recently had the privilege of leading an amazing multi-stakeholder community around this topic of data intermediaries. And where did we come from on that? We were looking at that traditional problem of notice and consent and that gap between people and technology, and really trying to find a more let's say subtle and future-proof way of managing that people-technology interaction. And I had the pleasure to collaborate with, I'm going to give a shout out to Dr. Jen King from Stanford University on that one as well. But just building on what Gilbert said there about pool data being such a type of data intermediary, if you can imagine that we're now in a situation whereby the reality of how people interact with technology is that the idea of sitting down in front of a computer or in front of your device and actively giving consent is not necessarily realistic anymore. It's not that it's invalid. It's just that the scale and the ubiquity and the sort of the permanence of our lives online means that that system is at the point where it's becoming unworkable. And I think the big question is it now unreasonable to put that burden onto people's shoulders? How can we meet in the middle in terms of sharing that responsibility?
Interesting. Great. Thank you. And then Chris, you're here from NatWest. How do you get into the industry? You focus on these topics, and tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, we're in a position where we are now, particularly with telcos, we're kind of consuming a lot of data. And our journey, obviously, as a bank provider of payment services, we have, regulatory expectation of authentication and identification. And as we're managing sort of fraud challenges and scam challenges, it's becoming increasingly kind of critical that we're able to leverage the data that we hold, but then bring in external sort of data insights. So we have done a lot of engagement. We've heard talk of the SIM swap sort of services through network operators, because we rely upon SMS one-time passcodes, and they're being sent out through SMS. So fraudsters react to that authentication. They target the SIM. They look to obtain those codes. We have now fraudsters will instead socially engineer customers. So we're trying to find ways in which we can identify that a customer is maybe speaking to a fraudster and are giving those codes out verbally. So we obviously, you look out into the marketplace, be that finance, telco or other, and the power of data. So we've been somewhat through necessity dragged into data, but now we're very much looking forward in terms of where is that other data that we can leverage to better either enable customer journeys so we can make their onboarding that much simpler, or we can give them the services much more readily, or specifically with fraud and with the scams issues that we have, how do we mitigate loss without detrimentally impacting customer experience?
Great. And one of the things that I learned in preparing for this panel was that the regulatory umbrella under which you do this is not consent from the user, right? It's actually protecting the user from potential fraud. So can you talk, like both you and Alistair can touch on this in terms of this kind of back channel sharing of information is happening because you are trying to act in the best interests of your customers.
Yeah, so I think, and I'm certainly not a privacy lawyer or an expert. In fact, my day job is frustrating our privacy professionals in terms of asking for data and to use data in certain ways. But I think essentially it kind of comes out of the Data Protection Act that there's this sort of legitimate use case. So for the instances of preventing fraud or crime, we are able to share data that is sort of reasonable. So for ourselves particularly, you'll see that when you are logging into, say, online banking or mobile banking, we will have services that will be looking to identify the device you're using, the IP. Do you have any remote access running? Are you behind a VPN? If we're seeing the location of whereabouts are you located. And then we maybe have behavioral biometrics tools that are looking for the way in which you're using your keyboard. Is your cadence normal as compared to your prior use? Is your mouse movement indicating stress, and maybe indicators of kind of social engineering happening in the background? So yeah, we kind of lean into that, which isn't to say that we get kind of carte blanche to go after everything, because there definitely is pushback to say, that isn't okay, that is too much reach. But certainly, when we've engaged with the network operators, they I guess get asked similar questions.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my perspective, whilst I was saying the mobile operators sit on a ton of real-time information, they're also incredibly protective of that information, and they're also highly regulated, right? Like the banks. So I've mentioned, we've discussed SIM swap. We can tell you whether your phone is being forwarded. We can tell you if your number has been recycled. We can tell you what device you've got. We can tell you if your device has been changed. We've got all these insights. But before we're allowed to share any of those insights, everything has to be passed through multiple data privacy lawyers. And what we do is we write up. This was mentioned actually earlier. You don't necessarily own your information. You own a copy of your information, right? So what we do with our data privacy lawyers is we're very, very clear on the purpose for which that data can be shared. And we will agree with the NatWests of the world, with the Infobits of the world. Will say, okay, Infobit, we're going to share this information. We define it very clearly, what we share, how we share it, and why we share it. And Infobit will agree as well that when they receive that information from us, they will not use that information for anything else other than the purpose for which we've agreed.
Yeah, that's one of the magic things you have in Europe is purpose binding. We don't have that in the United States. So, Gilbert, I want to go to you and sort of the data union. So I was actually part of conversations that Shiv, your CEO, was involved in within an organization called Radical Exchange, really exploring these ideas and sort of like what should these new things be called? And sort of data unions was settled on in part because it aligns with historical precedent of having labor unions. So I was wondering if you could touch on sort of like how is it actually going to work, right? Like that's where I understand how a labor union works. How does a data union work relative to the parties in the ecosystem?
Well, I think the answer is, I mean, if you think about how long it's taken to get to an accepted term, I mean, there's still lots of terms flying about. There's intermediaries, there's trusts, and actually the UK did a lot of the leading work in this space a few years ago. The data union is actually summed up really well by Shiv in terms of we all talk about platforms and their users. You know, users get used and members get served. And I think, you know, it's slightly cheesy, but it's something that, you know, the average consumer needs to grasp hold of. Because in practice, data unions are, and that's, you know, the role of the intermediary is still crystallizing from a point where we've had de facto intermediaries which have been with very large platforms. And I think, you know, to what extent regulator or regulations are, you know, the agents of positive change in this, groups like Radical Exchange in terms of think tanks are really good at filling in the blanks, because I think, you know, a constant theme today has been about, sadly, about how regulation like GDPR and privacy lawyers, apologies to any here, have kind of been seen like a sort of a drag factor on business, or almost, you know, business prevention officers, because they're saying, hold on, we need to create our own structures. You've got a situation where every organization has to, with varying degrees of success, been marking their own homework to a certain extent. The role of a data union is to have a transparent, you know, a charter, rules of association and the way by which they represent their members, and then to display that transparently and operate on that basis. The simplest analogy, I mean, you know, last week I was voting in the local elections, and I hope everyone did too, where applicable. You know, it's quite clear. I go and vote for people who will represent me at a local level or at a mayoral level, and it's, you know, it's clear how they will operate and how they will be remunerated. That hasn't existed in the, you know, in the ad tech world, in the Lumascape. And I think data unions, as I say, it's relatively early in the day, but there's a concerted move between regulators, think tanks, and stakeholders like governments to try and drill, you know, nail this down, and then apply the funky technology that we've been hearing about so far to the different aspects of the problem. So it's a moving target.
Yeah. And can I go to you and have you share a little bit about the sort of forward-looking ideas that surfaced, and sort of what could happen if data intermediary, like what's needed to really support data intermediaries fully coming into being?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just a main point here is that what is the role of the intermediary? Why do you employ the intermediary in the first place? And in that regard, the models can look very different. We've heard here about data unions, for example, or maybe data trust, data collaboratives, whatever term that you want to use, but that idea of a neutral third-party zone, if you will, that's going to represent the rights and responsibilities of those that are exchanging data. So in the case of the B2C relationship, the intermediary might be representing the interests of the person. But if you take that to a very futuristic and sophisticated solution, you could potentially get to the point where your digital identity could inform the types of permissioning that's going to follow your data right throughout the data value chain. So we're getting into a really complex zone here, but to ultimately make this a reality, to really empower people and to ensure that their agency accompanies the data about them, because as we've heard, nobody really owns their data. There are rights attached to certain pieces of data. So you have your digital identity is informing permissions, and those permissions can accompany that data as it flows throughout the data value chain. So to be completely blunt about what's required, obviously you need an incentive that there's going to be collaboration between the private sector and their customers. There also has to be, of course, policy support for this type of system. And as we know, and as we've heard in the GDPR, you have those 6 grounds. Of course, legitimate interest is there for fraud, but by and large, most of the time, you're relying on notice and consent. There would need to be legal support to allow for something like that, where your digital identity could inform your permissions throughout the value chain. And then the third piece of the puzzle is technology itself. We're not there. There are amazing companies that are developing really interesting solutions. We see lots of examples in banking, in payments, in fraud prevention, and cybersecurity. But as has been mentioned already, a lot of privacy policy and a lot of policy around data has been taking place in the vacuum of privacy and of data protection. That's not a bad thing, but that serves very much as a foundation. And if we're looking really at the data ecosystem as a whole, and I think taking account of the fact that data policy is something that affects every man, woman, child, business, government in the world, it's no longer a technology issue. It's no longer just a privacy issue. We need to get smarter and more inclusive about the stakeholders that we bring into that conversation, so that we can learn about those technologies, and so that that type of support can be built for really asking ourselves, what type of system do we want in place in 5, 10 years time? Do we want to have data unions that we can turn to? Do we want to have a piece of technology that's going to manage our permissions for us?
Thanks. That's great. You touched on something that I want to ask Gilbert a little bit more about, which is like the regulatory, what's coming down the regulatory pipeline, especially particularly in the European context, that lays the groundwork for what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, I was in Brussels a couple of weeks ago, and what really, at an event which was led by Margaret Vestager, and what is really driving a new suite of European regulations. So there's 4 different laws which are currently sailing pretty unopposed through the European legal process, and which will hit towards the end of next year, which about creating all the things which GDPR promised, and to a certain extent we've got gummed up. I mean, GDPR, props to it. It was created, a framework for the legal monetization of data and preservation of rights. What these 4 acts are zooming in on are the different aspects. So it's around the role of online platforms in terms of preserving digital rights. It's around making sure that the next generation of tech represented by IoT doesn't represent, that their business model isn't another data land grab. So it's nothing less than moving away from compliance as the objective to, Margaret Vestager was saying that the silver bullet with all of this was creating a vibrant data economy where data can flow and where these intermediaries, as yet to be nailed down, but play a central role. The other key thing is, finding the means to do this, monetization. So the EU is putting its money where its mouth is in terms of putting 2 billion euros in funding towards kickstarting this economy. So this is, one of the big challenges in privacy tech has been that you've had to build sort of kick-ass tech, and you've also had to create your own business model. So with these new regulations, the EU is very much setting the direction of travel, both for the US, which has its own particular kind of tapestry of privacy regulations, and other parts of the world, and the UK, which, as I mentioned previously, had been a forerunner in this. So the EU is really setting the pace, and they want to achieve this within the next 5 years. So I think the world is watching them very closely.
Yeah, great. So we'll get to, I'd love to take questions from the audience, so raise your hands and we'll bring you the mic. But one more question for Chris and Alistair is, what's the value flow in how you're currently exchanging data? Like, is there payments that go for these kind of checks that you're providing?
Yeah, so there are, sadly, yes. So we have to pay for the insights, and I think for us, it's sort of, there's a recognition that there's obviously an aspiration that sort of cost is balanced and is reasonable, and certainly you see new technologies will come in and they'll have a higher cost and it will sort of come down as more and more kind of peers within the industry take it up. But there is a cost. I mean, obviously the theory is that, as an example, for us to use SMS one-time passcodes, which are ubiquitous, and we're able to do that with many millions of customers with relative ease. The cost of doing so is that you have to do SIM swap checks, and it's kind of accepted that we're on the round gaining because we can engage with customers in an easier kind of mode. But there is a cost. I mean, with some of the things where we're maybe enabling account opening and onboarding, again, cost will be there, and it's a matter of understanding how many more customers may we get on book more quickly with a more positive experience. So yeah, at the minute there is definitely a cost, and it's sort of accepted, albeit we are now, I think, in an interesting space where the banks have an awful problem with scams, with authorized push payments, and with impersonation scams, particularly that are SMS based, that are phone based, that are spoofing SMS headers, call line identifiers. So actually the telcos are not our problem, but are part of the problem. They are enabling the connection of a fraudster to a customer. So it makes that kind of position where they can offer us some solutions with insights that maybe that person has received a phone call, has been on a call for a long time, and charging us for it becomes, as I say, murkier in terms of the reasonableness of that.
Cool.
And I would say, yeah, and again, I'd say that we're working with the banks to help our mutual customers. For us to work with the banks, obviously, we've got to have a team, and therefore, there is cost involved. It was really the banks that helped kickstart this, right? Because it was almost a no-brainer for them to use the data. But more and more, we're obviously seeing our products being used within hospitality and things like that, for onboarding and things. And so as the program grows, obviously, the teams grow and the investment from the mobile network operators grow.
Cool. So, are there any questions from the audience first?
It'll be a no.
Okay. No questions from the online? No, they're not paying attention anymore. So thank you very much.